Vladimir Putin, Part 9. Further observations. Before we reach our conclusion as to what Vladimir Putin is, we turn to yet further sources to gather information, observation, opinion, and evidence to make a determination about the Russian president. An article that appeared in the LA Times stated as such that Putin's rambling, grievance-laced public statements since the Ukraine crisis surged to the fore have been deeply unsettling to a world audience. On Sunday, he announced he was placing his country's nuclear deterrent forces on alert, railing against a Western campaign of punitive economic sanctions. Necessity of having control, response to perceived threat to control. In other speeches, he has denounced Ukrainian leaders as drug abusers and fascists, smearing, assertion of control, all the while insisting that Ukraine, a sovereign nation for more than 3 decades, is not even a real country. This is because, as I've mentioned previously, that in the mind of Vladimir Putin, his narrative, his worldview suggests that it's not, and therefore that provides the justification for the action that he is taking. He isn't invading a country, so he doesn't understand why so many people are getting so worked up about it. Indeed, he sees their responses as entirely self-serving, that they claim to support this false nation, when one doesn't, and if they were acting properly, they would recognise that his actions were the appropriate ones, and that he was dealing with an issue in his own backyard, that he's entitled to do so, and he isn't actually causing a major problem, because after all, the Ukraine isn't a proper country. The article explains that such behaviour is notable in a leader who has long cultivated an international image as a cool-headed, cold-blooded calculator of cost and benefit, ruthless to be sure, but on some level rational in his pursuit of geopolitical goals. The suggestion, of course, that this is a cultivated image. The suggestion that I would offer is that this is what he's actually like, and merely he allows that to be presented to the world also. The article explains some world leaders, however, have come away from recent encounters with Putin with the impression he was increasingly unmoored from reality. Well, he operates in a different reality to those leaders, but of course, many of those leaders themselves function in their own reality and only have a shared majority perspective because it suits their own need to assert control. But if that assertion of control was threatened, they would respond appropriately. So, for example, Western nations invariably stand together, even though many of their leaders are narcissists. However, if the needs of that particular leader were being threatened by the other leaders in that group, then they would look out for their own self-interest. No clearer example of that took place with regard to Britain's exit from the EU. Boris Johnson, narcissist. Emmanuel Macron, narcissist. Angela Merkel, narcissist. Did they all act in tandem when it came to the issue of Britain and the EU? No, they did not. Johnson, in order to further his own agenda, as I've explained in the parts and analysis about him, did what mattered to him and took Britain out of the EU. He operated to his own version of reality, which meant that Britain was best served by no longer being in the EU, and that he was the man to achieve that, because, of course, it allowed him to achieve the prime aims. Accordingly, Macron, a narcissist himself, would, of course, see that Putin's stance is that of being unmoored from reality. What he ought to be saying was, he's operating in a different reality to that of mine. Macron travelled to Moscow for talks with Putin weeks before Russian forces commenced their wide-ranging assault, described him as more rigid, more isolated. At that meeting, like several others held lately with dignitaries and aides, Putin was photographed sitting at the end of an extremely long table, which has emerged as something of a meme, underscoring a vast degree of disconnection. It isn't disconnection in the sense that people understand it, it is simply that he is asserting control by demonstrating that he's set apart, and he's also protecting his health, which is another assertion of control. Finland's president, Sauli Niinisto, a frequent interlocutor over the years, recounted an abrupt shift in Putin's demeanour during a recent phone call, with the Russian leader suddenly abandoning a normal conversational exchange to embark on a strident recital of demands, assertion of control, with a more heated example of fury. Putin appears to exhibit a considerable control over that ignited fury, but will, where he deems it appropriate, allow it to be manifested. He has behaved in a way which is very difficult to predict, Ninistio said on Sunday on CNN, but that might also be intentional, namely to behave in a way that brings confusion to surroundings. His latter observation is likely to be accurate. Even some traditional allies expressed disbelief that Putin would make the leap from menacing Ukraine with a massive troop build-up and attention-getting tactic that forced the West to engage in high-level talks with him to attempt a violent dismemberment of the country, very different from the nearly bloodless 2014 seizure of the Crimean Peninsula. After last week's invasion commenced, Czech Republic President Miloš Zeman, a long-time backer, called the Russian leader a madman. The notion that a head of state can reap foreign policy rewards by appearing utterly unpredictable, a tactic President Nixon was said to have employed to try to rattle North Vietnam, also had recent echoes during the Trump administration, when supporters maintained he cleverly flummoxed opponents by unexpectedly breaking with established norms. Again, this is all about the assertion of control. But many Putin watchers see a far more dangerous phenomenon at work in his attempted conquest of Ukraine, a sovereign country of 44 million people. Michael McFaul, the US ambassador to Russia under President Obama, suggested in a weekend talk show appearance that over time the Russian leader had become to believe his own propaganda. What Mr. McFaul fails to understand is that Putin has always believed that his own propaganda. It is his world. He believes it is right. That is his mindset. He understands the way that other people see the world, but dismisses that as being incorrect and based on a false view. McFaul stated, "I met him in 1991. I've been watching him since he was Prime Minister in 1999. McFaul said on Sunday on NBC, "I sat in the room with him for 5 years when I worked in the Obama administration. I speak Russian. I listen to him and I know what he says. He's increasingly unhinged in the way he talks about Ukraine's leaders, especially President Zelensky." This shows a lack of understanding of what Putin is to describe him as unhinged. He is not. But of course, it suits a narrative to describe him as such to try and explain away his behaviours. It would be far more advantageous for the West to actually understand what he is, to get into his mind, to understand what he is and what his next moves would be, rather than labelling him as unhinged and a madman. He is none of those things. Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State in President George W. Bush's administration, said the Russian leader had been acting erratic. Again, that is the assertion of control and an appearance that is being generated to assert control over his opponents. "I met with him many times, and this is a different Putin," Rice said on Fox News. "He was always calculating and cold, but this is different. There is never deepening delusional rendering of history." No, his rendering of history has always been there. It may not have been allowed to the surface, however, and that is now happening as part of the means by which he asserts control, by triangulating his opponents with this particular historical narrative. Some analysts suggest that Putin's decades in powers have begun to act as something of a reality-distorting force field. He's always had that. An echo chamber of sorts. He's always had that. Few close to him dare to express any disagreement. Long-time personalist leaders like Putin are the most prone to making mistakes. Andrea Kendall-Taylor, a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, wrote on Twitter, "His decision to attack Ukraine is a painfully unfortunate example of that." Green of King's College said Putin being surrounded by people who are afraid to tell him hard truths might offer a sounder explanation than unverifiable theories about COVID isolation-induced paranoia. He's always had a paranoia. It's nothing to do with COVID isolation or the Russian leader suffering from some kind of terminal illness. He is not suffering from some kind of terminal illness that is suddenly causing him to behave in this way. Everyone knows the saying about people who fail to learn the lessons of history being condemned to repeat it. It's a slight misquotation, but the idea that we should be able to avoid making the same mistakes by studying the past is undeniably attractive. So what does history tell us about the behaviour of Europe's largest country, Russia, which is currently fighting an undeclared war with its neighbour Ukraine? NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg singled out Russia's military ambitions in a speech on Friday, describing 2014 as a black year for European security. He revealed that the alliance recorded more than 400 incursions into foreign airspace by Russian warplanes last year, a common occurrence and is again provocation and projection and an assertion of control, which was around 4 times as many as in 2013. The previous day, British fighters were scrambled to intercept 2 Russian bombers over the English Channel, an episode that resulted in the Russian ambassador being summoned to the Foreign Office. Around the time Stoltenberg was giving his assessment of the Russian threat to peace, the reality of the situation in Ukraine was brought home by the shelling of a cultural centre in Donetsk, killing at least 6 people. In theory, the conflict is between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists who have declared a breakaway republic, but no one seriously believed that Russia isn't behind the fighting. More than 5,000 people at that time are believed to have been killed since April, yet public attention, which suddenly turned to Ukraine after shooting down a Malaysian passenger plane in July last year, is focused elsewhere. Again, historically, while the terrorist organisation Islamic State is responsible for huge numbers of casualties, it's killed far fewer people in Europe than have died in the Ukrainian conflict. It could be argued that the spectacular type of warfare favoured by ISIS has actually done the Russian government a favour, deflecting attention with a series of attention-grabbing atrocities. Russia's tradition of covert warfare is long established, and some Kremlin officials visibly enjoy the process of repeating denials which are barefaced lies. In a repeat of recent history, dead Russian soldiers are once again being returned to their families without any information about where they were killed, lack of accountability, denial. The names of more than 260 had previously been published on a website run by opponents of President Putin, along with a map of eastern Ukraine showing where they died. The Russian government at that time denied involvement, but 10 Russian paratroopers were captured in Ukraine in August. The mother of a Russian soldier whose body was returned with his legs blown off said he'd phoned her to say his unit was being deployed to Donetsk. When something similar happened during the Second Chechen War, the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya interviewed bereaved mothers and wrote about what was going on. She was assassinated in Moscow on President Putin's birthday in 2006, a month or so before the Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko was murdered in London. At a public inquiry previously, Litvinenko's death was described as an act of nuclear terrorism on the streets of a major city. Ben Emerson, the QC representing Mr. Litvinenko's widow, said the trail led directly to Putin and called for him to be unmasked by this inquiry as a common criminal dressed up as a head of state. This is a staggering statement. Some commentators are reluctant to accept it, arguing that Putin generally feels under threat from NATO. He will do, because it's a threat to control. Greece's inexperienced new government, led by the coalition of left-wing parties known as Syriza, is making friendly overtures towards Russia. Nobody wants a new Cold War, but the evidence suggests they're making a mistake of epic proportions. Putin displays a complete absence of empathy in his behaviours, and is painfully thin-skinned. He found being mocked by the punk band Pussy Riot so intolerable that 2 of the women ended up in penal colonies. Threat to control, nullification of threat to control. He exhibits a lack of fear and an enjoyment of risk, which means he enjoys baiting people he sees through his world lens as opponents. Opponents have had their assets seized and have been sent to harsh prisons in Siberia. Neighbouring countries live in fear of cyber attacks, such as the one that took place in Estonia in 2007, or of course as military invasion, as we've just seen recently. Other factors have affected Putin's mindsets and behaviours. Involving himself in Syria made him an international figure, which would appeal to his grandiosity and a more overarching assertion of control, and the fact that he won the war in Chechnya gave him an inflated sense of what his military is like, and that may well have resulted in the difficulties that he's currently experiencing with regard to the invasion of the Ukraine. It might be the case that if the Chechen conflict had not gone as successfully, it might have been the case that Putin might not have had the confidence to order his troops to invade Ukraine, as he did last month. At the beginning of Putin's presidential career, he made a deal with his predecessor Boris Yeltsin that he would not be prosecuted for corruption after he stepped down. He has not, however, been able to manage to get such a deal for himself. Therefore, Putin cannot step down because nobody is ever going to give him that opportunity, and therefore he remains locked with regard to his assertion of control. Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State who served from 1997 to 2001, who recently died, met with the newly appointed acting President Putin and outgoing President Boris Yeltsin in 2000. In an opinion piece in the New York Times of February 23, 2022, she wrote, "Whereas Mr. Yeltsin had cajoled, blustered and flattered, Mr. Putin spoke unemotionally and without notes about his determination to resurrect Russia's economy and quash Chechen rebels. Flying home, I recorded my impressions. Putin is small and pale," I wrote, "so cold as to be almost reptilian." In the 20 years since we met, Mr. Putin has charted his course by ditching democratic development for Stalin's playbook. He has collected political and economic power for himself, co-opting or crushing potential competition, while pushing to re-establish a sphere of Russian dominance through parts of the former Soviet Union. Like other authoritarians, he equates his own well-being with that of the nation and opposition with treason. He is sure that Americans mirror both his cynicism and his lust for power, and that in a world where everyone lies, he is under no obligation to tell the truth. Because he believes that the United States dominates its own region by force, he therefore thinks Russia has the same right. Those are very perceptive observations by the recently deceased Madeleine Albright. These observations about his further behaviours from a variety of viewpoints continue to provide us with a raft of indicators. And with all of that, we now turn in part 10 to the conclusion to determine what is Vladimir Putin. Join me there.